The engine roared to life as Derek slammed the truck door, his laughter mixing with that of his buddies, Tyler and Brandon. Through the windshield, I could see him shaking his head, that familiar smirk playing across his lips as he threw the vehicle into reverse. The gravel crunched under the tires as they backed away from the isolated mountain cabin, leaving me standing in the Colorado wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back and $23 in my pocket. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Good luck figuring this out, Amanda. Derek had sneered just moments before, tossing my purse at my feet after removing my credit cards, my phone, and even my house keys. Maybe this will teach you not to embarrass me in front of my friends again. The sound of their vehicle grew fainter until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the vast silence of the Rocky Mountains. I stood frozen in that moment, watching the dust settle on the empty dirt road, trying to process what had just happened. We'd driven up here for what Derek called a romantic weekend getaway, just the two of us reconnecting after months of tension. But Tyler and Brandon had shown up unexpectedly, turning our cabin into a bachelor party atmosphere, complete with excessive drinking and increasingly crude jokes. When I'd quietly asked Derek if we could have some time alone, he'd exploded in front of his friends, accusing me of being controlling and possessive. The argument escalated quickly, with his buddies egging him on, until Derek made the decision that would change everything. The reality of my situation hit me like a physical blow. I was stranded 40 miles from the nearest town, with no way to contact anyone, no transportation, and barely enough money for a single meal. Derek had systematically removed every lifeline I had, leaving me as helpless as he'd always claimed I was. For 3 years, he'd slowly convinced me that I was incapable of handling anything important on my own. He managed our finances because I was too impulsive with money. He drove everywhere because I was a nervous driver who might cause an accident. He handled all our social plans because I was too shy to make real friends. Standing there in the mountain air, I realized how completely I'd allowed myself to become dependent on someone who saw me as nothing more than a burden to be discarded when convenient. The cabin behind me was locked, the key having disappeared with Derek and his friend. My phone lay somewhere in the truck, probably being laughed over as they drove back toward civilization. The sun was already beginning its descent behind the peaks, and the temperature would drop significantly once darkness fell. I had to move, had to find shelter, had to survive until I could figure out a way home to Portland. I started walking down the mountain road, my designer boots completely inappropriate for the rough terrain. Derek had always insisted I dress a certain way, maintaining the image he wanted to project of success and sophistication. Now those same clothes that had made me feel polished and put together in the city felt like a costume, marking me as an outsider who didn't belong in this harsh environment. After 2 hours of walking, my feet bleeding inside my boots and my throat parched from the dry mountain air, I finally saw signs of civilization. A small gas station and convenience store sat at a crossroads, its neon sign flickering in the gathering dusk. The clerk inside, a weathered man in his 60s, looked up from his newspaper as I stumbled through the door. "You okay, miss? You look like you've been through something." I tried to explain my situation without breaking down completely, watching his expression shift from confusion to disbelief to something that might have been pity. He let me use the store phone to call the local sheriff's office, but the deputy who arrived 30 minutes later seemed unsurprised by my story. "Happens more than you'd think," he said, shaking his head, as he filled out his report. "City folks come up here, relationships go south, and somebody gets left behind. Usually works itself out when the abandoned party calls family or friends for help. But that was the problem. Derek had systematically isolated me from everyone I'd once been close to. My college friends had gradually stopped calling after Derek consistently found reasons why I couldn't join their gatherings. My parents lived across the country, and our relationship had grown strained after Derek convinced me they were too controlling and negative. My job at a small marketing firm in Portland barely covered my personal expenses. Since Derek handled all the major bills and considered my income play money, the deputy offered to drive me to the nearest bus station in the morning, but the ticket to Portland would cost more than I spent that night in the gas station's small break room, curled up on a torn couch while the clerk worked his shift. He'd refused payment for the instant soup and coffee he'd given me, saying his daughter was about my age, and he'd hoped someone would show the same kindness if she ever found herself in trouble. Morning brought a painful clarity about my situation. I could call my parents and endure their inevitable "I told you so" about Derek, returning to a life where I'd be treated like a child who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. I could reach out to my old friends and admit that I'd abandoned them for a man who'd ultimately abandoned me. Or I could figure out how to move forward on my own, starting with absolutely nothing but my own determination. The bus ticket to Austin, Texas cost $18, leaving me with $5 and whatever courage I could muster. I chose Austin because it was the furthest destination my money would cover, and because I'd read articles about it being a city where creative people could reinvent themselves. If I was going to start over with nothing, I reasoned, it might as well be in a place known for embracing fresh starts. The Greyhound journey took 14 hours, with stops in small towns where I watched other passengers with their normal lives and cell phones and people who cared about their arrival times. I dozed fitfully against the window, waking periodically to the reality that I was truly on my own for the first time in years. Derek's voice echoed in my head with every mile. "You can't handle anything without me. You'll come crawling back within a week." Austin's bus station at dawn was a chaotic mix of commuters, homeless individuals, and travelers like myself in various states of transition. I used the restroom to wash my face and try to make myself presentable, though my wrinkled clothes and exhausted expression hardly inspired confidence. The $5 in my pocket wouldn't even cover breakfast, let alone shelter for the coming night. I started walking through downtown, marveling at the energy of a city waking up around me. Food trucks were setting up for the breakfast rush, their aromatic offerings making my empty stomach clench with hunger. Street musicians tuned their instruments while business people hurried past with their coffee and purp. For all my fear and uncertainty, there was something intoxicating about being completely anonymous in a place where no one knew my story or limitations. Near the warehouse district, I noticed a help wanted sign taped to the window of a food truck painted in vibrant blues and yellow. Rosa's Kitchen was written in cheerful script across the side, with smaller text advertising, "Authentic Mexican-American fusion." A woman in her late 50s was setting up tables outside the truck, her movements efficient and purposeful despite the early hour. "Excuse me," I approached hesitantly. "I saw your sign about needing help." Rosa Martinez looked me up and down, taking in my inappropriate outfit and obvious desperation. Her dark eyes were kind but shrewd, the gaze of someone who'd learned to read people quickly and accurately. "You ever worked food service before?" I shook my head honestly. "But I'm willing to learn. I need work, and I'm not afraid of hard labor." Something in my tone must have convinced her because she nodded toward the truck. "Can you start right now? I need someone to help with prep and serve customers. Pay is $10 an hour. Cash daily, plus tips. You mess up my food or steal from me, you're gone immediately." "Understood," I nodded eagerly, following her into the compact but efficiently designed mobile kitchen. The space was smaller than Derek's walk-in closet back in Portland, but every inch was utilized for maximum functionality. Rosa handed me an apron and pointed to a sink full of vegetables. "Start washing and chopping those peppers, small dice like this." She demonstrated the knife technique with quick, practiced motions. "We'll see how you do with simple tasks before moving you up to anything complicated." The morning rush began within an hour, and I found myself thrust into a world completely different from anything I'd experienced. Construction workers and office employees lined up for Rosa's breakfast burritos and tacos, their orders rapid-fire and specific. Rosa worked the grill with incredible speed and precision while calling out instructions to me. "More salsa verde on table 2. That order needs extra jalapeno. Don't forget the lime wedges." I fumbled initially, struggling to keep up with the pace and remember the dozens of small details that made each order perfect. But something about the environment energized me in a way my old office job never had. The immediate feedback from customers, the physical challenge of the work, the satisfying transformation of raw ingredients into meals that people genuinely enjoyed. It all felt more real and meaningful than the abstract marketing campaigns I'd worked on for years. By lunchtime I was moving more confidently around the small space, anticipating Rose's needs and even making suggestions about garnishes and presentation. She watched me work with increasing approval, occasionally nodding when I handled a difficult customer or managed multiple orders simultaneously. "You're not completely hopeless," she said during our afternoon break, counting out my day's wages. "Come back tomorrow if you want." Same time, same deal. $68 in tips and wages felt like a fortune after starting the day with $5. More importantly, I'd proven to myself that I could learn new skills quickly and contribute meaningfully to something productive. Derek's voice in my head grew a little quieter as I walked through Austin with money I'd earned through my own effort. Finding shelter for the night proved more challenging. The cheapest motel I could find wanted $40, which would leave me with insufficient funds for food the next day. A desk clerk at the YMCA suggested the women's shelter across town, but the intake process required documentation I didn't have, and a waiting list that stretched several days. I ended up spending my second night in Texas sleeping in a 24-hour laundromat, dozing fitfully in a plastic chair while my only set of clothes tumbled in the washing machine. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while late-night
Preparing
shift
and
workers
narrating
and
this story took us a
insomniacs
lot of
drifted
time,
in
so
and
if you
out,
are enjoying
most
it,
too absorbed
subscribe
in
to
their
our
own
channel.
struggles to
It
pay
means a lot
attention
to
to
us.
mine. The
Now
next
back
morning,
to the story.
I returned to Rosa's truck with damp hair and the same clothes, now at least clean. Rosa noticed my appearance but didn't comment, simply handing me the apron and pointing toward the prep station. "Today you're learning the grill," she announced. "Yesterday proved you can follow instructions. Now let's see if you can think on your feet." The breakfast rush was even busier than the day before, with a line of customers stretching around the block. Rosa positioned me at the smaller grill, handling eggs and bacon while she managed the more complex orders on the main cooking surface. The heat was intense, the orders came constantly, and there was no room for hesitation or second-guessing. I burned the first 2 orders completely, prompting Rosa to snatch the spatula from my hand and demonstrate proper temperature control. "The grill tells you when it's ready. Listen to the sizzle, watch for the color change, smell when the fat renders properly. Cooking is a conversation between you and the food." Her patience surprised me, especially given the mounting pressure from hungry customers. Instead of abandoning me to handle simpler tasks, she stayed beside me through the rush, correcting my technique and gradually allowing me more independence as my confidence grew. By the end of the week, I was handling half the grill orders myself, had memorized the regular customers' preferences, and was even suggesting modifications to Rosa's recipes based on what I'd observed about customer reaction. The physical demands of the work had transformed my soft office body into something stronger and more capable. My hands, once manicured and soft, now bore small burns and cuts that I wore as badges of competence. More importantly, I'd found a place to live. Sophie Chen, a graduate student who frequented the food truck for lunch, had mentioned her roommate moving out and needing someone to split the rent on a small apartment near the university. The space was tiny and furnished with hand-me-downs, but it was mine in a way that Derek's carefully designed condo had never been. "You seem different from when you first showed up," Rosa commented one evening as we cleaned the truck after a particularly busy day. "More solid somehow, like you're actually here instead of just going through the motions." She was right, though I couldn't have articulated it then. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based on my own judgment rather than seeking approval or avoiding conflict. The immediate consequences of my choices, whether a customer enjoyed their meal, whether I managed the rush efficiently, whether I contributed meaningfully to the truck's success, created a feedback loop that rebuilt my confidence day by day. Carlos, Rosa's husband, joined us most evenings to help with closing procedures and equipment maintenance. He was quieter than his wife, but equally skilled, with an engineer's precision when it came to the truck's mechanical systems and a gentle teaching style when showing me how to maintain the equipment. "Rosa sees something in you," he told me one night as we cleaned the fry. "She doesn't usually invest this much time in new employees. Most people wash out within a few days because they can't handle the pace, or they think food service is beneath them." I'd certainly thought food service was beneath me when Derek and I would grab quick lunches from food trucks, treating the workers as invisible servants rather than skilled professionals. Now I understood the expertise required to consistently produce quality food under pressure, the physical stamina needed for 10-hour shifts, and the emotional intelligence necessary to handle difficult customers while maintaining a positive attitude. 3 weeks into my new life, Rosa made an announcement that changed everything. Carlos and I are thinking about expanding, maybe a second truck or a small restaurant, but we'd need someone we trust to help manage the business side, someone who understands both the food operation and the customer service elements. She was looking directly at me as she spoke, though she didn't explicitly offer the position. Instead, she handed me a stack of invoices and receipts. Think you could organize these and maybe create some kind of system for tracking our expenses and income? My current method involves shoving everything into a shoebox and hoping for the best. That evening in my small apartment, I spread Rosa's financial records across my second-hand kitchen table and began creating the organizational systems she needed. My marketing background proved unexpectedly useful as I developed tracking spreadsheets, identified cost-saving opportunities, and even created a simple social media strategy to build customer loyalty. The work felt completely different from my old job, where I'd created abstract campaigns for products I barely understood to reach demographics defined by focus groups. Here, every decision had immediate tangible consequence. A successful promotion brought lines of customers and increased revenue. Poor inventory management meant running out of popular items and disappointing people who'd come specifically for Rosa's food. When I presented my analysis to Rosa and Carlos the following week, their reaction exceeded my expectations. Not only had I organized their records efficiently, but I'd identified several opportunities to reduce costs and increase profitability without compromising food quality. "Where did you learn to do this?" Carlos asked, studying my projected budget for the proposed second truck. "I used to work in marketing," I admitted, "but I never felt like I was contributing anything meaningful. This feels different because I can see how the numbers connect to real outcomes." Rosa smiled knowingly. "That's because you care about the business now, not just the paycheck. When you're invested in the success, you find solutions instead of just following procedure." Over the following month, my role evolved from food prep and customer service to business operations and strategic planning. Rosa taught me advanced cooking techniques while I modernized their record-keeping and customer outreach. We developed new menu items together, with me handling the nutritional research and cost analysis while she perfected the recipes. The transformation wasn't just professional. Living independently for the first time in years, I discovered preferences and interests that Derek had either dismissed or actively discouraged. I joined a community garden where volunteers grew vegetables for local food banks, finding unexpected satisfaction in nurturing plants from seed to harvest. I took Spanish classes at the community center, motivated by wanting to communicate better with some of our customers and understand Rosa's conversations with her Spanish-speaking supplier. Most surprisingly, I started dating again, though my approach was completely different from the passive role I'd played with Derek. When James, a regular customer who taught high school history, asked me out for coffee, I suggested we meet at the farmer's market instead so I could learn about local suppliers while getting to know him better. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than the intense dependency that had characterized my time with Derek. 4 months after arriving in Austin with nothing, I'd become Rosa's business partner. We'd secured a loan for the second food truck and identified a location for our eventual restaurant. My days were filled with menu development, vendor negotiations, staff training, and the 100 small decisions required to run a successful food business. The physical transformation was remarkable. My body, strengthened by months of physical labor, felt more capable and confident than it ever had during my years of gym memberships and structured exercise classes. My skin had cleared from the stress-related breakouts that had plagued me during my relationship with Derek. Most importantly, my mind felt sharp and focused, engaged with problems that mattered and decisions that had real consequences. But the emotional transformation was even more profound. The constant anxiety that had characterized my final year with Derek, the walking on eggshells, feeling of never knowing what might trigger his criticism or anger, had disappeared entirely. I made mistakes regularly in my new role, but they were learning opportunities rather than sources of shame. Rosa and Carlos offered correction and guidance, without the underlying current of disappointment or superiority that had marked all of Derek's feed. I'd found my people, my purpose, and my place in a way that felt both surprising and inevitable. The woman who'd been abandoned in the Colorado mountains, helpless, dependent, and convinced of her own inadequacy, bore little resemblance to the person I'd become. Derek had tried to teach me that I was nothing without him. Instead, he'd accidentally created the circumstances for me to discover exactly who I could be when free to become myself. The morning Rosa handed me the keys to our second food truck, I felt a surge of pride that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. The vehicle gleamed in the Austin sunshine, painted in the same vibrant blues and yellows as our original truck, but featuring updated equipment and a more efficient layout based on everything we'd learned from our first operation. "This is yours to manage," Rosa said, her voice carrying both confidence and a hint of nervousness. "Carlos and I will handle the original location, but the East Side route is your responsibility completely. Hire your own staff, develop your own customer relationships, make your own decisions about daily operations." The weight of that responsibility should have terrified me. Instead, it energized me in ways I'd never experienced. After months of learning every aspect of the food truck business, from inventory management to customer service to equipment maintenance, I finally had the opportunity to implement my own vision and prove that the confidence Rosa and Carlos had shown in me was justified. I spent the following week driving through East Austin, studying traffic patterns and identifying prime locations for our mobile restaurant. The demographic here was different from our downtown clientele, more diverse economically and culturally, with different taste preferences and price sensitivities. Rather than simply replicating our existing menu, I worked with Rosa to develop offerings that would appeal to this new market, while maintaining the quality standards that had made our original truck successful. The breakfast burrito remained our signature item, but I added a more affordable option featuring simpler ingredients and smaller portions for budget-conscious customers. I also introduced weekend brunch specials targeting the young professionals who were increasingly moving into the rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods along our route. Hiring staff proved more challenging than I'd anticipated. The food service industry experienced constant turnover, and finding reliable employees who could handle both the physical demands and the customer service requirements took several attempts. My first hire, a recent culinary school graduate named Marcus, lasted exactly 3 days before deciding that food truck work was beneath his professional aspirations. My second attempt was more successful. Patricia, a single mother in her 40s who'd been laid off from her factory job, approached our truck during the lunch rush and asked about employment opportunities. Her complete lack of food service experience was offset by her obvious work ethic and her genuine need for steady income. "I'll do whatever you need me to do," she said simply. "I've got 2 kids depending on me, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Training Patricia reminded me of my own early days with Rosa, except now I was the one providing guidance and encouragement rather than receiving it. Teaching someone else the techniques I'd learned, watching her confidence grow as she mastered new skills, gave me a deeper appreciation for the patience Rosa had shown during my own learning process. Within 3 weeks, Patricia was handling the grill independently while I managed customer orders and cash transactions. Her steady presence and reliable work ethic freed me to focus on the business development aspects of our expansion, building relationships with our regular customers, and identifying opportunities for further growth. The East Side route quickly developed its own character and rhythm, distinct from the downtown location but equally successful. Our morning stop at the construction site near the highway brought a rush of workers who appreciated fast service and hearty portions. The lunch crowd at the software company's office park wanted healthier options and more sophisticated flavor combinations. Our afternoon position outside the community college attracted students who needed affordable meals and appreciated our willingness to customize orders for various dietary restrictions. Each location required different approaches to customer service, menu presentation, and operational efficiency. The construction workers valued speed and consistency above all else, so I streamlined our morning offerings to minimize preparation time while maximizing flavor impact. The office park customers were willing to wait longer for more complex orders,
so I introduced daily specials featuring seasonal ingredients and more elaborate preparation techniques. The community college presented unique challenges and opportunities. Many students had limited budgets but diverse cultural backgrounds, creating demand for authentic flavors at affordable prices. I partnered with Rosa to develop a student discount program and began featuring rotating specials inspired by the international student population's diverse food traditions. 3 months into managing the second truck, our revenue had exceeded even Rosa's optimistic projection. More importantly, we'd built a loyal customer base that actively promoted our business through word-of-mouth recommendations and social media posts. The sense of accomplishment I felt each evening, counting the day's receipts and planning tomorrow's operations, was deeper and more satisfying than any achievement from my previous career. But success brought unexpected challenges. Our rapid growth had attracted attention from competitors who resented our encroachment into what they considered their territory. 2 established food trucks began parking deliberately close to our locations, trying to steal customers through aggressive pricing and promotional tactics. More concerning was the increased scrutiny from city inspectors and licensing officials. Our permits were valid, and our operations exceeded health department standards, but the frequency of surprise inspections suggested someone was filing complaints against us. Each inspection disrupted our service and created anxiety among our staff. Even though we consistently passed with perfect scores, the harassment escalated when someone vandalized our second truck during an overnight parking period, spray painting crude messages across the side panels and slashing 2 tires. The damage wasn't extensive enough to prevent operations, but the psychological impact was significant.
Patricia arrived for her morning shift to find me scrubbing paint off the truck's exterior, and her immediate offer to help clean up demonstrated the loyalty and commitment that made our partnership work. "Whoever did this is scared of what we're building," she said pragmatically as we were. "You don't attack something unless it threatens you. That means we're doing something right." Her perspective helped me understand that the harassment was actually a sign of our success rather than a reason to doubt ourselves. Instead of retreating or modifying our operations to avoid conflict, we doubled down on providing excellent service and building stronger relationships with our customers and suppliers. I reached out to other food truck operators who'd faced similar challenges, learning that territorial disputes were common in the industry, but usually resolved themselves once established businesses realized that the market was large enough to support multiple operators. Several veteran food truck owners offered advice about dealing with harassment and shared strategies for building community support that could protect against future incidents. The experience taught me important lessons about leadership and resilience that would prove crucial in the months ahead. Managing conflict while maintaining team morale, protecting our business interests without compromising our values, and building alliances within a competitive industry all required skills I'd never developed during my time with Derek or in my previous office job. Rosa and Carlos noticed the changes in my approach to challenges, commenting on my increased confidence and strategic thinking. What had begun as their investment in a promising employee had evolved into genuine partnership, with my contributions to the business's growth and development earning their respect and trust. 6 months after taking control of the second truck, Rosa approached me with a proposal that would reshape our entire operation. She and Carlos had been offered an opportunity to cater a major corporate event, a 3-day conference with over 1,000 attendees. The contract would be the largest single job in our company's history, but it would require coordinating both trucks and hiring additional temporary staff to handle the volume. "We want you to manage the entire operation," Rosa explained. "Carlos and I will handle food preparation and logistics, but you'll be responsible for staffing, scheduling, customer service, and making sure everything runs smoothly. If we succeed, it could lead to similar contracts that would allow us to expand into full-service catering." The corporate catering event was unlike anything we'd attempted before. Instead of serving individual customers from our regular locations, we'd be providing breakfast, lunch, and afternoon snacks for conference attendees over 3 consecutive days. The logistics were complex, requiring precise timing, careful coordination between our 2 trucks, and seamless service despite the unfamiliar venue and challenging setup conditions. I spent 2 weeks preparing for the event, developing detailed operational schedules, hiring and training temporary staff, and coordinating with the conference organizers to ensure our setup met their requirements and expectations. The preparation process was exhausting but exhilarating, combining project management skills from my marketing background with the practical knowledge I'd gained through months of hands-on food service experience. The first day of the conference tested every system we'd developed. The breakfast rush was more intense than anything we'd experienced, with hundreds of attendees arriving simultaneously and expecting immediate service. Our temporary staff struggled initially with the pace and volume, but Patricia's leadership and my systematic approach to workflow management kept the operation running smoothly despite the pressure. By the second day, our team had found its rhythm. The temporary staff had adapted to our standards and procedures, the conference organizers had refined their crowd management approach, and our food preparation was running ahead of schedule. Most importantly, the attendees were responding enthusiastically to our offerings, with many commenting on the quality and creativity of our menu items. The final day brought an unexpected challenge when one of our main competitors showed up to observe our operation, presumably gathering intelligence about our methods and customer relationship. Instead of feeling threatened, I used the opportunity to demonstrate our professionalism and expertise, ensuring that every aspect of our service exceeded expectations, while maintaining the friendly, efficient approach that had made our trucks successful. When the conference ended, the organizers were so impressed with our performance that they immediately offered us contracts for 2 additional events and provided referrals to other companies seeking high-quality catering services. More significantly, the confidence I'd gained from managing such a complex operation convinced me that I was ready for the next phase of my professional development. That evening, as we cleaned equipment and counted receipts from our most successful 3 days ever, Rosa made an announcement that would change everything about our business relationship. "Carlos and I have been talking about retirement," she said, her tone careful and measured. "Not immediately, but within the next 2 years. We're in our 60s, and this business requires energy and stamina that won't last forever." She paused, studying my reaction before continuing. "We'd like to offer you the opportunity to buy us out gradually, taking full ownership of both trucks and any future expansion. You've proven that you understand every aspect of the operation, and you've built relationships with customers and suppliers that would be impossible to replace." The proposal was both thrilling and terrifying. Owning the business outright would give me complete control over its direction and growth, but it would also mean taking full responsibility for its success or failure. The financial commitment would stretch my resources, requiring careful planning and probably additional investors or loans. More importantly, it would represent the complete transformation from the dependent, uncertain woman Derek had abandoned in Colorado to a confident entrepreneur capable of building and managing a successful business. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. Derek had tried to prove my worthlessness by stripping away everything he'd convinced me I needed. Instead, he'd created the circumstances for me to discover capabilities and strengths I'd never known I possessed. I spent the following weeks developing a business plan for the acquisition, working with a small business attorney to understand the legal requirements and consulting with accountants about the financial implications. The process was complex and occasionally overwhelming, but I approached each challenge with the same systematic determination that had carried me through my early days at the food truck. The plan that emerged was ambitious but realistic. I would purchase Rosa and Carlos's ownership stake over 18 months, using revenue from our current operations, plus a small business loan to finance the transition. In addition to maintaining our existing truck routes, I proposed expanding into restaurant catering and exploring the possibility of opening a brick-and-mortar location that would serve as our commissary kitchen and allow us to offer sit-down dining. When I presented the plan to Rosa and Carlos, their reaction exceeded my expectations. Not only did they approve of my strategic vision, but they offered to stay involved as consultants during the transition period, helping to train additional staff and maintain relationships with key suppliers and customers. "You've become the daughter we always hoped Sophia would be," Rosa said, referencing their own daughter who lived across the country and had never shown interest in the food business. "We're not just selling you a company, we're entrusting you with something we've built our lives around." The legal paperwork took several months to complete, during which time I continued managing daily operations, while gradually taking on additional responsibilities for long-term planning and strategic decision-making. By the time the ownership transfer was finalized, I was already functioning as the company's primary decision-maker, with Rosa and Carlos providing guidance and support rather than direct management. On the day I signed the final documents making me the sole owner of what had grown into a small but thriving food service company, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with gratitude and determination. The woman who'd been abandoned with $23 in the Colorado mountains had built a business that employed 6 people, served hundreds of customers weekly, and generated enough revenue to support not just my own comfortable lifestyle, but also the livelihoods of my staff and their families. That evening, I stood outside our original food truck as Patricia cleaned the grill and prepared for the next day's service. The familiar sounds and smells of our operation, the satisfaction of another successful day, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, all combined to create a moment of perfect clarity about the path my life had taken. I'd learned that Derek's cruelest insult had actually been the key to my freedom. He'd called me nothing, and in doing so had forced me to discover exactly what nothing could become when freed from the limitations others imposed. Nothing had turned out to be everything: capable, confident, successful, and complete on its own terms. The transformation wasn't just professional or financial, though those achievements were significant. More fundamentally, I discovered that my worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's validation or support. The skills I'd developed, the relationships I'd built, the business I'd created, all emerged from within myself rather than being granted by someone else's approval or permission. But even as I celebrated this independence and success, I had no idea that Derek was about to reappear in my life, forcing me to defend everything I'd built and prove once and for all that the woman he'd abandoned no longer existed. The notification chime on my phone barely registered as I worked through the evening inventory, tallying supplies and planning tomorrow's menu specials. After 14 months of building my business, these administrative tasks had become second nature, a peaceful end to another successful day. Patricia had left an hour earlier after helping me close down both trucks, and the commissary kitchen was quiet except for the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sounds of Austin traffic. I almost ignored the message completely, assuming it was another promotional email or customer review notification. But something about the sender's name made my blood freeze. Derek Thompson. The phone trembled in my hands as I opened the message, my mind struggling to process words I'd never expected to see again. Amanda, I know where you are. I know about your little food truck adventure. We need to talk about your future, because this fantasy has gone on long enough. I'll be in Austin tomorrow evening. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. The message contained no apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd done to me, no recognition that I might have built a life worth protecting. Instead, it carried the same entitled expectation that had characterized our entire relationship, the assumption that my choices were temporary diversions from the path he'd determined for my life. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage I hadn't experienced since those first terrifying days in Colorado. The rational part of my mind knew that Derek had no power over me anymore, no ability to force me back into the diminished existence I'd escaped. But the emotional patterns carved by 3 years of psychological manipulation don't disappear overnight, and his sudden reappearance activated every anxiety and self-doubt I'd worked so hard to overcome. My first instinct was to run, to disappear again before he could find me, and try to tear down everything I'd built. Austin was a big city, and I could relocate my business, change my name, start over somewhere else. But as I looked around the commissary kitchen, seeing the equipment I'd purchased, the systems I'd developed, the evidence of success I'd earned through my own effort, I realized that running would mean abandoning not just a business, but an entire identity I'd fought to create. Instead, I called Sophie, my roommate and closest friend in Austin. Her graduate studies in psychology had given her insight into manipulative relationships, and her own experience surviving an abusive family situation made her uniquely qualified to help me process Derek's unexpected reappearance. He's trying to destabilize you mentally before he even arrives, she explained after I read her the message. The vague threats, the dismissive language about your fantasy, the assumption that he can dictate your future. It's all designed to make you feel like that scared, dependent person you used to be. Sophie was right, but understanding Derek's tactics, intellectually, didn't diminish their emotional impact. I spent a sleepless night, cycling through worst-case scenarios, imagining confrontations where Derek somehow convinced everyone that I'd stolen his money, or manipulated Rosa and Carlos into giving me a business I didn't deserve. The confidence I'd built over months of success felt fragile against the familiar weight of his disapproval and control. Morning brought a measure of clarity along with the routine demands of operating two food trucks. Patricia noticed my distraction immediately, her maternal instincts alert to any change in my usual demeanor. "Something's wrong," she observed as we prepared for the breakfast rush. "You look like you haven't slept, and you've checked your phone more times in the past hour than you normally do all day." I explained the situation briefly, watching her expression shift from concern to indignation, to protective determination. Patricia had been raised by a single mother who'd survived multiple abusive relationships, and she recognized the dynamics I was describing with painful familiarity. "This man abandoned you in the mountains with no money or phone, and now he thinks he can just show up and reclaim you like lost property," she said, her voice rising with each word. "We're not going to let that happen. You've got a whole community here who knows exactly who you are, and what you've accomplished." Her fierce loyalty reminded me that I wasn't facing Derek's return alone. Over the past year, I'd built genuine relationships with customers, suppliers, employees, and neighbors who valued my contributions to their lives and community. These weren't the superficial social connections Derek had monitored and controlled, but authentic friendships based on mutual respect and shared experience. Rosa arrived at the commissary kitchen during our afternoon prep time, ostensibly to check on inventory but actually responding to Patricia's text about Derek's impending arrival. Her reaction was even more protective than Patricia's, channeling the maternal energy she'd invested in my transformation into fierce defense of what we'd built together. "This pendejo thinks he can waltz back into your life and undo everything you've accomplished," she said, mixing English and Spanish in the rapid-fire way that indicated serious anger. "Let him come. Let him see what you've become without his permission or approval." Carlos appeared shortly afterward, bringing with him James, my boyfriend of 8 months, who taught high school history and had become deeply integrated into my circle of friends and business associates. The spontaneous gathering in my commissary kitchen felt like a war council, with each person contributing their perspective on how to handle Derek's return. "The most important thing is to control the circumstances of any interaction," James advised, his teacher's experience with difficult parents informing his strategic thinking. "Don't let him choose the time, place, or terms of engagement. If you're going to face him at all, do it on your territory with your support system present." The consensus was clear: if Derek wanted to see what I'd become, we'd show him exactly that. Instead of hiding or minimizing my success, we'd demonstrate the full scope of what I'd accomplished and the strength of the community I'd built. The confrontation would happen at my commissary kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my independence and the people who'd supported my transformation. I spent the rest of the day preparing for Derek's arrival with the same systematic approach I used for major catering events. I organized financial records demonstrating my business's success, gathered testimonials from satisfied customers, and prepared talking points that would clearly articulate my position without getting drawn into emotional manipulation or personal attack. Most importantly, I called my attorney to discuss legal protections in case Derek attempted to claim any ownership interest in my business or tried to interfere with my operation. The lawyer assured me that Derek had no legal standing to affect my business, but she also provided guidance about documenting any harassment or threats that might constitute grounds for a restraining order. Derek arrived precisely at 6 o'clock the following evening, driving a rental car that probably cost more than most of my employees made in a month. Through the commissary kitchen's front window, I watched him sit in the parking lot for several minutes, checking his phone and presumably preparing for what he'd assumed would be a simple conversation about my return to Portland. When he finally approached the building, I opened the door before he could knock, taking control of the interaction from the first moment. He looked exactly as I remembered, perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, radiating the casual arrogance that had once seemed sophisticated but now appeared shallow and performative. "Hello, Derek," I said calmly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. His eyes swept over me with obvious surprise,
taking in the changes that 14 months of physical labor and personal growth had created. I was stronger, more confident, more substantial than the woman he'd abandoned. My work clothes were practical rather than fashionable, my hands showed the calluses and small scars of honest labor, and my entire demeanor radiated competence and self-possession. "Amanda," he said, his tone carefully modulated to project concern rather than the anger I could see in his eyes. "You look different. Healthier, I suppose, though I have to say this whole situation has been incredibly difficult for everyone back home." The familiar manipulation technique expressing concern while simultaneously criticizing no longer had the power to destabilize me. Instead of apologizing or explaining myself, I gestured toward the commissary kitchen behind me. "Would you like to see what I've built here?" I asked, making it clear that this was my space and my terms for the conversation. Derek followed me into the kitchen, his expression shifting from condescension to confusion as he took in the professional-grade equipment, organized inventory systems, and obvious signs of a thriving business operation. Rosa and Carlos were working at the prep stations, their presence both protective and purposeful as they prepared for tomorrow's service. "This is Rosa and Carlos Martinez," I said, introducing them with obvious pride. "They taught me everything about the food service industry and trusted me enough to sell me their business when they decided to retire." Derek's handshake with the older couple was perfunctory, his attention focused on processing information that didn't fit his assumptions about my capabilities or prospects. He'd expected to find me struggling in some menial job, desperate enough to welcome rescue from my temporary rebellion. "It's impressive," he admitted reluctantly, "but surely you can see that this isn't sustainable long-term. Running a food truck isn't a career, Amanda. It's something people do between real jobs." Rosa's sharp intake of breath indicated her offense at Derek's dismissive attitude, but she remained professionally silent as I'd requested. This confrontation was mine to handle, though her supportive presence gave me strength I might not have found alone. "Actually, Derek, this is a real job," I replied evenly. "A successful business that employs 6 people, serves hundreds of customers weekly, and generates enough profit for me to live comfortably while saving for future expansion." I led him through the commissary kitchen, explaining our operations with the confidence of someone who understood every aspect of the business from food preparation to financial management. Derek's attempts to find flaws or minimize my achievements became increasingly strained as the scope of my success became undeniable. "The profit margins in food service are notoriously thin," he said, grasping for familiar ground, "and the work is physically demanding. You're going to burn out within a few years, and then what? You'll be in your 30s with no real career experience, no retirement savings, no prospects for advancement." His prediction might have carried weight if delivered to the uncertain woman he'd abandoned, but it bounced harmlessly off the confidence I'd built through months of proven success. I'd heard similar doubts from other people during my transition, and I'd answered them all with results rather than arguments. "My retirement savings are actually quite healthy," I said, pulling out the financial statements I'd prepared. "Business ownership builds equity in ways that traditional employment doesn't, and as for advancement prospects, I'm exploring opportunities to open a restaurant and expand into full-service catering." Derek studied the financial documents with the expertise of someone who'd built his own consulting business, his expression growing more troubled as he realized the numbers supported everything I'd claimed. His entire strategy had been based on the assumption that I'd failed without his guidance and support. "Look, Amanda," he said, switching to a more personal approach, "I know you're angry about what happened in Colorado. It was a stupid mistake, and I've regretted it ever since. But we built something together over 3 years. We had plans, a future, a life that worked for both of us." The attempt to rewrite history was breathtaking in its audacity. Our relationship had worked for Derek because I'd made myself smaller and smaller to accommodate his expanding ego and demands. The life he mourned was one where my needs and preferences were subordinate to his comfort and convenience. "What we built was entirely dependent on my compliance and self-diminishment," I replied, feeling James's supportive presence as he entered the kitchen behind Derek. "You didn't want a partner, you wanted an accessory, someone who would validate your choices without making demands of her own." James positioned himself near the prep counter, not threateningly but clearly present as part of my support system. Derek noticed the territorial dynamic immediately, his jaw tightening as he realized he was outnumbered and out of his element. "And you are?" Derek asked, his tone shifting toward territorial challenge. James Peterson, my boyfriend replied calmly, extending his hand with professional courtesy despite the obvious tension. I teach history at the local high school. Amanda and I have been together for 8 months. The information clearly unsettled Derek, who'd probably assumed I was living alone and isolated, vulnerable to his return and grateful for renewed attention. Instead, he was discovering that I'd built not just a successful business but a complete life surrounded by people who valued and supported me. 8 months, Derek repeated, his voice carrying undertones of possession and anger. So you moved on pretty quickly after abandoning our relationship. The attempt to shame me for building new relationships after he'd literally abandoned me in the wilderness was so absurd that I almost laughed. Instead, I used the moment to articulate something I'd wanted to say for over a year. You ended our relationship when you drove away laughing in Colorado, I said firmly. Everything I've built since then is the result of my own choices and effort. You don't get to disapprove of decisions you forfeited the right to influence. Derek's mask of reasonable concern began slipping as he realized that his usual manipulation techniques weren't working. The woman he'd left behind had been replaced by someone who couldn't be gaslit, intimidated, or emotionally manipulated into compliance. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising with frustration. You're acting like I'm some kind of villain for trying to salvage our relationship after a temporary separation. People have fights, Amanda. Couples work through difficult. They don't throw away years of shared history over one bad day. The reframing of systematic emotional abuse as a temporary separation and calculated abandonment as one bad day demonstrated exactly why our relationship had been so destructive. Derek's inability to acknowledge the real nature of his behavior, even when confronted directly, proved that nothing fundamental had changed about his character or approach to relationship. Derek, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned through months of managing employees and making difficult business decisions. I need you to leave now. I'm not returning to Portland with you. I'm not resuming our relationship. I'm not interested in your opinion about my life choice. His face flushed with anger as the reality of his complete powerlessness over my decisions finally penetrated his assumptions about the conversation's outcome. The entitled expectation that I would eventually capitulate to his wishes had been the foundation of his approach, and its collapse left him scrambling for alternative strategies. You can't be serious about choosing this over everything we built together, he said desperately. A food truck business in Texas over a real life with someone who knows you better than anyone. The assertion that he knew me better than anyone was so fundamentally wrong that it crystallized everything problematic about our former relationship. Derek had never known me. He'd known only the diminished version of myself I'd presented to avoid conflict and maintain his approval. The person you knew was performing a role designed to make you comfortable, I replied. This is who I actually am when I'm free to make my own choices. Patricia chose that moment to enter the kitchen through the back door, returning from an errand with impeccable timing. Her presence reminded Derek that my support system extended beyond romantic relationships to include professional colleagues who depended on my leadership and success. Everything okay in here? She asked, her tone casual but her eyes alert to potential trouble. Derek was just leaving, I said, moving toward the front door to make it clear that the conversation was ending. He followed reluctantly, his expression cycling through anger, disbelief, and what might have been genuine hurt. At the threshold, he made one final attempt to regain control of the narrative. You'll regret this decision, Amanda. When the novelty wears off and you're dealing with the reality of working 16-hour days for uncertain income, you'll remember what stability felt like. My door is always open when you come to your senses. The threat disguised as magnanimous offer was so typical of Derek's approach that I almost felt nostalgic for the predictability of his manipulation. But the woman who might once have been destabilized by such predictions no longer exists. I'm already dealing with the reality of working 16-hour days, I said calmly. The difference is that now I'm building something that belongs to me, rather than making someone else's life more comfortable. Derek left without another word, his rental car disappearing into Austin traffic with the same finality as his departure from the Colorado mountains.
But this time I wasn't the one left behind and abandoned. I was the one choosing to stay exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the people and work that had helped me discover who I really was. The silence that followed his departure felt different from the terrifying isolation I'd experienced after his first abandonment. This silence was full of possibility and peace, the quiet satisfaction of a challenge met and overcome. Rosa emerged from the kitchen where she'd been pretending to work while obviously listening to every word of the confrontation. Her expression mixed pride, relief, and fierce maternal satisfaction. "That man has no idea what he threw away," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt like approval and celebration combined. James wrapped his arms around both of us, his relief evident in the way his shoulders relaxed now that the threat to our relationship had been neutralized. Patricia joined the group embrace, her laughter bubbling up with the joy of witnessing someone successfully defend their hard-won independence. "Did you see his face when he realized you weren't coming back?" she said between giggles. "He looked like someone had told him the sun wasn't going to rise tomorrow." The spontaneous celebration in my commissary kitchen, surrounded by people who'd supported my transformation and witnessed my growth, felt like the completion of a journey that had begun with abandonment and despair. Derek had tried to prove that I was nothing without him. Instead, he'd forced me to discover exactly how much everything I could become when freed from the limitations he'd imposed. That night, after everyone had gone home and the kitchen was clean and quiet, I stood in the same spot where Derek had tried to diminish my achievements and convince me to abandon the life I'd built. The contrast between his vision of my future and the reality I'd created was so stark that I felt almost grateful for his cruelty. His abandonment had been the catalyst for everything good in my current life. Without his calculated betrayal, I might have spent years gradually losing myself in his expectations and demands. Instead, his worst behavior had become the foundation for my best life. I'd learned that being called nothing by someone who didn't value your authentic self was actually a gift. It meant you were free to become everything you were meant to be, unencumbered by their narrow vision of who you should remain. Derek's cruelest insult had become my greatest liberation, and his return had only confirmed how completely I'd outgrown the prison he'd tried to build around my potential. The woman he'd abandoned in Colorado was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, more capable, and infinitely more content than the person who'd once sought his approval and feared his disapproval. I'd shown him exactly what nothing looked like, and it turned out to be everything I'd ever wanted to become. The weeks following Derek's departure brought an unexpected surge of energy and ambition that surprised even me. His failed attempt to reclaim control over my life had the opposite effect he'd intended, crystallizing my determination to push beyond every limitation he'd ever imposed on my thinking. If he'd returned expecting to find someone grateful for rescue, he'd instead encountered a woman who'd barely scratched the surface of her potential. The morning after our confrontation, I woke with unusual clarity about the next phase of my business expansion. For months, I'd been cautiously considering the possibility of opening a brick-and-mortar restaurant, but Derek's dismissive attitude toward my food truck success had ignited something more aggressive in my planning. I would show not just him but everyone who'd ever underestimated what I could accomplish, exactly how far determination and hard work could carry someone who refused to accept other people's limitations. I spent the day walking through different neighborhoods in Austin, studying foot traffic patterns and analyzing the competition with fresh eyes. The East Side was rapidly gentrifying, creating opportunities for businesses that could bridge the gap between longtime residents and newcomers. My food trucks had already proven that I could serve both demographics successfully, adapting my offerings to meet different needs while maintaining consistent quality standards. The location I'd been considering for months suddenly seemed perfect rather than merely adequate. A former auto repair shop on a busy corner had been vacant for 6 months, its large windows and open floor plan offering possibilities that I'd been too cautious to fully envision. The neighborhood was diverse and walkable, with established businesses that would complement rather than compete with a restaurant focused on the same Mexican-American fusion cuisine that had made my truck successful. I called the property owner that afternoon, requesting a meeting to discuss lease terms and renovation possibilities. My financial position was stronger than I'd realized, with the truck business generating consistent profits, and my personal expenses remaining modest despite my increased income. More importantly, my track record of success gave me credibility with lenders and investors that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional employment. Rosa and Carlos were initially skeptical of such rapid expansion, concerned that I might be overextending myself or moving too quickly beyond the proven model that had brought us success. But when I showed them my detailed business plan, complete with financial projections and operational timelines, their concerns shifted to enthusiastic support. "You've thought through every detail," Carlos admitted, studying the renovation blueprints I'd commissioned. "This isn't impulsive dreaming, it's strategic planning based on solid market research." The restaurant concept would serve as both our commissary kitchen and a full-service dining establishment, allowing us to maintain the food truck operations while expanding into catering and sit-down service. The kitchen would be designed to handle high-volume production for our mobile units, while accommodating the more complex preparation required for restaurant-style plating and presentation. I hired an architect who specialized in restaurant design, working closely with her to create a space that would be both functional and inviting. The dining room would seat 60 people, with large windows that connected the interior to the bustling street life outside. An open kitchen concept would allow customers to watch food preparation, creating theater around the cooking process while demonstrating our commitment to fresh, made-to-order preparation. The design process was collaborative and creative in ways that reminded me why I'd once loved working in interior design. But instead of trying to please a client with tastes and preferences different from my own, I was creating a space that reflected my vision and value. Every decision, from the locally sourced wood tables to the vibrant murals celebrating Austin's cultural diversity, represented choices I made based on my understanding of what would serve our customers and community. Financing the expansion required more complex negotiations than I'd anticipated, involving multiple lenders and a partnership agreement with a local investor who specialized in supporting minority-owned business. The process taught me advanced lessons about business finance, legal structures, and risk management that complemented the practical skills I'd learned through hands-on food service experience. Patricia proved invaluable during the expansion planning, her operational insights helping me design workflow systems that would maintain our quality standards despite increased volume and complexity. Her promotion to operations manager represented both recognition of her contributions and acknowledgement that the business had grown beyond what any single person could manage effectively. "You're going to need more than just good food to make this work," she observed during one of our planning sessions. "The restaurant business is different from food trucks. People expect a complete experience, not just a quick meal." Her point was well taken, and I began developing service standards and staff training programs that would ensure our restaurant provided the same level of customer satisfaction that had made our trucks successful. The hiring process would be more selective, requiring servers and kitchen staff who could handle both the technical demands of restaurant service and the interpersonal skills necessary for creating positive dining experience. James became my unofficial consultant on the cultural and historical aspects of the restaurant concept, helping me understand how our Mexican-American fusion approach could honor traditional techniques while appealing to Austin's diverse population. His teaching background proved valuable for developing staff training materials that explained not just what we were serving, but why our approach to food represented a meaningful contribution to the local dining scene. The construction phase lasted 4 months, during which time I learned more about project management, contractor coordination, and permit acquisition than I'd ever expected to need. Each challenge required creative problem-solving and persistent follow-up, skills that transferred directly from my food truck experience, but required application on a much larger scale. I spent most days on the construction site, working alongside contractors and subcontractors to ensure every detail met my specification. The hands-on approach wasn't just about quality control, it was about understanding every system in the building so I could maintain and repair equipment when necessary. Derek's voice occasionally echoed in my memory, suggesting that such involvement was beneath someone with my education and background, but I'd learned to value practical knowledge over abstract credentials. The kitchen equipment installation was particularly complex, requiring coordination between multiple vendors and precise timing to ensure everything arrived and was installed in the correct sequence. I worked closely with Rosa to select equipment that would serve both our current needs and anticipated growth, making investments that would support expansion rather than require replacement as our volume increased. 2 weeks before our planned opening, I realized we needed additional staff to handle the restaurant's demands without compromising our food truck operations. The hiring process revealed how much my reputation in Austin's food service community had grown over the past year and a half. Applications came from experienced servers and cooks who wanted to work for a business known for treating employees well and providing opportunities for advancement. The training period was intensive, combining technical instruction about our menu and service standards with education about our company culture and customer service philosophy. I insisted that every staff member understand not just their specific responsibilities, but how their role contributed to the overall dining experience we were trying to create. Marcus, the culinary school graduate who'd quit my food truck after 3 days, reappeared during the hiring process with a much more humble attitude and genuine appreciation for what I'd built. His formal training combined with newfound respect for the hard work involved in food service made him a valuable addition to our kitchen team, and his hiring represented a satisfying full-circle moment in my professional development. The soft opening was limited to friends, family, and regular customers from our food truck operations, giving us an opportunity to test our systems and refine our procedures before facing the scrutiny of restaurant critics and general public. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, with several guests commenting that the restaurant felt like a natural evolution of what they'd loved about our mobile operation. Sophie brought her graduate school cohort for one of our test dinners, and their enthusiastic response to both the food and the atmosphere confirmed that we'd successfully created something that appealed to Austin's educated, culturally diverse population. More importantly, their questions about my business journey and expansion plans reminded me how far I'd traveled from the uncertain woman who'd once needed permission to make simple decisions. The official opening was scheduled for a Thursday evening, chosen deliberately to avoid the weekend crowds, until we'd had time to work through any operational issues with lighter customer volume. Local food bloggers and restaurant reviewers had been invited, along with city council members and other business owners who'd supported my growth over the past month. On opening night, I stood in the dining room, 30 minutes before service began, watching my staff complete their final preparations, with the systematic efficiency we'd practiced throughout our training period. The transformation from empty auto repair shop to bustling restaurant felt miraculous, but I knew it was actually the result of careful planning, hard work, and the support of people who'd believed in my vision. The first customers were Rosa and Carlos, arriving exactly at opening time with flowers and a bottle of champagne to celebrate the milestone. Their pride in what we'd accomplished together was evident in their beaming smiles and obvious excitement about experiencing our food in this new set. "This is what we dreamed about when we first offered you that partnership," Rosa said, taking in the dining room's warm lighting and carefully curated atmosphere. "You've created something that honors our traditions, while building toward the future." The evening exceeded every expectation I'd dared to have. Service ran smoothly despite the complexity of managing both kitchen and front-of-house operations simultaneously. Customer responses were enthusiastic, with several diners asking about our food truck locations and expressing surprise that the restaurant was connected to the mobile operations they'd already discovered and loved. The restaurant critic from Austin's Alternative Weekly arrived unannounced, a strategy I'd anticipated and prepared for by ensuring every dish met our highest standards, regardless of who was ordering. Her subsequent review, published 3 days later, described our restaurant as a sophisticated evolution of food truck excellence, proving that Austin's best mobile chefs can transition seamlessly to brick-and-mortar success. But the most meaningful feedback came from Patricia, who'd been working in restaurants for over 20 years before joining my food truck operation. At the end of our first full weekend of service, she pulled me aside with tears in her eyes. "I've never worked for someone who trusted me to make real decisions about operations," she said. "You've created something special here, not just for the customers, but for all of us who get to be part of it." Her words reminded me that business success wasn't just about profit margins and customer satisfaction, but about creating opportunities for other people to grow and contribute meaningfully to something larger than themselves. The jobs I was providing weren't just paychecks, but pathways for people like Patricia to develop skills and build careers that might have been impossible in more traditional employment situations. 3 months after opening, our restaurant was booked solid most nights, with a waiting list that extended several weeks for weekend reservations. The success had attracted attention from investors interested in helping us expand to other cities, and food industry publications,
had featured articles about our transition from food trucks to full-service dining. More significantly, I'd been invited to speak at a small business conference about entrepreneurship and growth strategies, an opportunity that would have terrified the woman Derek had abandoned, but excited the person I'd become. Sharing my story with other aspiring business owners felt like a natural extension of the mentoring relationship Rosa had provided during my own learning process. The conference presentation went better than I'd hoped, with audience members asking detailed questions about everything from financing strategies to staff management to maintaining quality during rapid expansion. Several attendees approached me afterward, seeking advice about their own business ventures or expressing interest in franchise opportunities that could replicate our model in other markets. One conversation particularly stood out. A young woman who'd recently escaped an abusive relationship and was trying to rebuild her life while supporting two small children. Her story reminded me of my own journey, but also highlighted how much my perspective had changed over the past 2 years. "I feel like I'm starting from nothing," she said, her voice carrying the same desperation I remembered from my early days in Austin. "Nothing can be the best possible starting point," I replied, meaning every word. "When you have nothing to lose, you're free to discover everything you're capable of becoming." My advice to her was practical and specific. Start with skills you can develop quickly, find mentors who'll invest in your success, focus on providing genuine value to customers, and never let anyone else define the limits of your potential. But more than the specific suggestions, I hoped she could see in my example that complete transformation was possible regardless of how hopeless her current situation might feel. The conversation stayed with me for days afterward, reinforcing my growing conviction that my business success was meaningful primarily as a platform for helping other people discover their own capability. Derek's abandonment had forced me to confront my deepest fears about independence and self-sufficiency, but surviving that trial had equipped me to guide others through similar challenges. I began developing plans for a mentorship program that would provide support for women escaping abusive relationships or recovering from other traumatic life disruptions. The program would offer both practical job training in food service and broader education about business development, financial management, and personal empowerment.
Rosa and Carlos were enthusiastic supporters of the mentorship concept, seeing it as a natural extension of the values that had guided their own approach to business and community involvement. Their willingness to share their knowledge and resources with someone who'd started as a desperate stranger had created the foundation for everything I'd subsequently accomplished. "This is how good businesses grow," Carlos explained when I presented the mentorship proposal. "Not just by expanding operations, but by expanding opportunities for other people to succeed." The mentorship program launched 6 months later with 5 participants, each woman facing circumstances that reminded me of my own journey from helplessness to empowerment. Teaching them practical skills while watching their confidence grow provided satisfaction that exceeded even the pride I felt in my business accomplishments. One participant, Maria, had been abandoned by her husband with 3 children and no work experience outside the home. Another, Jennifer, was recovering from addiction while trying to regain custody of her daughter. Each woman's story was unique, but they all shared the determination to build something better from the ruins of what they'd lost. Training them reminded me how much I'd learned during my own transformation. Knowledge that had become so internalized I sometimes forgot it hadn't always been part of my skill set. Teaching food preparation, customer service, basic business operations, and financial planning to women who desperately needed these capabilities reinforced my understanding of how much growth was possible when someone was truly motivated to change their circumstances. The mentorship program also attracted attention from social service organizations and business development groups interested in replicating our model. Within a year, I was consulting with similar programs in 3 other cities, sharing the curriculum and operational strategies we'd developed while learning from other organizations' approaches to empowerment and job training. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching my original mentorship participants graduate to positions of greater responsibility within my own organization and other businesses throughout Austin. Maria became one of our most reliable shift supervisors, her natural leadership abilities emerging as her confidence grew. Jennifer parlayed her food service training into a management position with a catering company that specialized in corporate events. Their success stories validated everything I'd learned about the power of opportunity combined with support and training. More importantly, they demonstrated that my own transformation hadn't been unique or extraordinary, but simply what became possible when someone with potential was given the tools and encouragement necessary for growth. 2 years after Derek's failed attempt to reclaim me, I stood in my restaurant during the dinner rush, watching 23 employees serve food to a packed dining room, while our 2 food trucks operated successfully at their regular location. The business that had started with Rosa's willingness to give a desperate stranger a chance now employed nearly 30 people and served thousands of customers monthly. But the numbers, impressive as they were, mattered less than the transformation they represented. The woman Derek had called nothing had become someone who created opportunities for other people to discover their own worth and capability. His cruelest insult had become the foundation for a life dedicated to proving that everyone possessed untapped potential waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The realization that I'd not only survived his abandonment, but transformed it into the catalyst for unprecedented personal and professional growth, felt like the completion of a circle that had begun in the Colorado mountains. I'd learned that being reduced to nothing by someone else's cruelty was actually a gift, because it freed you to become everything you were truly meant to be. Standing in my thriving restaurant, surrounded by people whose lives had been improved through the opportunities I'd created, I understood that Derek's prediction about my future had been completely wrong. I hadn't regretted choosing independence over security, growth over comfort, or authenticity over approval. Instead, I'd discovered that the person who'd needed his permission and validation had been a pale shadow of who I could become when free to define success on my own terms. The woman he'd abandoned as worthless had built something infinitely more valuable than the carefully controlled life he'd offered, a legacy of empowerment that would continue growing long after our confrontation had faded into memory. I'd shown him exactly what nothing looked like, and it had turned out to be everything I'd never dared to dream possible. 5 years had passed since Derek's departure from my commissary kitchen, and the anniversary arrived without fanfare or conscious recognition, until I found myself pausing during the evening cleanup to absorb the magnitude of what surrounded me. The restaurant hummed with the efficient energy of a well-oiled operation, servers resetting tables while kitchen staff prepared for tomorrow's service with the practiced coordination that comes from working together toward shared goals. The expansion had continued beyond anything I'd initially envisioned. We now operated 4 food trucks across Austin, 2 permanent restaurant locations, and a catering division that handled everything from corporate events to wedding reception. More importantly, our mentorship program had graduated 43 women into sustainable employment, with 12 of them advancing to management positions within our organization or launching successful businesses of their own. The latest addition to our family of enterprises was a food production facility that packaged our signature sauces and spice blends for retail distribution throughout Texas. What had begun as customer requests for take-home versions of our restaurant offerings had evolved into a wholesale operation supplying grocery stores and specialty food shops across the Southwest. But tonight felt different from our usual operational rhythm. Tonight marked the culmination of a project that represented everything I'd learned about turning adversity into opportunity. The Austin Business Journal had selected me as Entrepreneur of the Year, an honor that came with a gala dinner and speaking engagement that would attract the city's most influential business leaders and civic organizations. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was the platform it provided for sharing the message that had emerged from my own transformation, that being stripped down to nothing by someone else's cruelty could become the foundation for building something far greater than what had been destroyed. Maria, now our director of operations, approached with the final preparations for closing. Her confidence and competence bore no resemblance to the frightened woman who'd entered our mentorship program 3 years earlier with no work experience and 3 children to support. Watching her coordinate complex logistics while mentoring newer employees had become one of my greatest sources of professional satisfaction. "Everything's set for tomorrow night," she reported. "The catering team has the menu finalized. Transportation is arranged for the mentorship program graduates who'll be attending, and your speech is loaded on the backup tablets in case there are technical issues." Her thoroughness and attention to detail reflected the standards we'd developed throughout our organization, but also demonstrated how much personal growth was possible when someone was given genuine opportunities for advancement. Maria's transformation from dependent survivor to confident leader paralleled my own journey in ways that validated everything I'd learned about human potential. James arrived as we finished the closing procedures, his presence a comforting constant in a life that had become busier and more complex than I'd ever anticipated. Our relationship had deepened gradually over the years, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than the desperate dependency that had characterized my time with Derek. "Ready for your moment in the spotlight?" he asked, his teacher's understanding of public speaking helping me prepare for what would be my largest audience to date. The question prompted reflection on how much my relationship with recognition and achievement had evolved. During my years with Derek, any success had been measured primarily by his approval and the status it provided within his social circle. Now, achievements felt meaningful because they created opportunities for other people to discover their own capabilities and build better lives. The gala dinner was held at one of Austin's most prestigious venues, with over 300 attendees representing the city's business, political, and nonprofit leadership. Walking into the ballroom, I was struck by how comfortable I felt in an environment that would have intimidated me tremendously just a few years earlier. The comfort came not from designer clothes or careful preparation, though both were present, but from the knowledge that I belonged here based on what I'd accomplished rather than who I'd impressed. The difference was subtle but profound, reflecting a shift from seeking validation to providing value. Rosa and Carlos were seated at our table, their pride evident in the way they beamed while introducing me to other business owners as our former student who became our teacher. Their presence grounded me in the relationships and experiences that had made everything else possible, reminding me that success was always built on the foundation of people who believed in your potential before you could see it yourself. The evening's program included several award presentations before mine, giving me time to observe the diverse paths that had led other entrepreneurs to recognition and success. Each story was unique, but common themes emerged: persistence through setbacks, willingness to take calculated risks, and the ability to learn from failures without being defeated by them. When my turn came to accept the award and address the audience, I walked to the podium with the same confidence I brought to managing a lunch rush or negotiating with suppliers. The skills were transferable because they were all rooted in understanding what needed to be accomplished and taking systematic steps to achieve those goals. 5.5 years ago I was abandoned in the Colorado mountains with $23 and no plan for survival. The man who left me there believed he was teaching me a lesson about my dependence on his support and guidance. The opening captured the audience's attention immediately, creating the dramatic contrast that would frame everything that followed. I could see people leaning forward, invested in understanding how such devastating circumstances had led to the business success they were celebrating. What he actually taught me was that being reduced to nothing by someone else's cruelty can become the foundation for discovering everything you're truly capable of becoming. When you have no choice but to rely on your own resources, you discover resources you never knew existed. The speech continued for 15 minutes, weaving together the practical lessons I'd learned about business development with the deeper insights about resilience and self-determination that had emerged from my transformation. I spoke about the importance of mentors like Rosa and Carlos, the power of providing opportunities for others to grow, and the responsibility that comes with success to create pathways for people facing similar challenges. But the most important message was about redefining what it means to have nothing. In our culture, being left with nothing is viewed as tragic and devastating, a failure that requires rescue or restoration to previous conditions. My experience had taught me that nothing could actually be everything. If you approached it as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. The audience response exceeded my expectations, with sustained applause and several people approaching afterward to discuss specific aspects of my journey or ask advice about their own business challenge. More meaningful were the conversations with other women who'd faced similar obstacles and found inspiration in hearing that complete transformation was possible regardless of starting circumstances. One conversation particularly stood out. A woman in her 50s introduced herself as the executive director of a statewide organization supporting domestic violence survivors, and she explained that my story had been shared within their network as an example of long-term recovery and empowerment. "We have women who are where you were in Colorado," she said, they can't imagine that survival is possible, much less success. Would you consider speaking at our annual conference? The invitation represented an opportunity to reach hundreds of women who were currently experiencing the same desperation and hopelessness I remembered from my early days in Austin. More importantly, it would allow me to share the message that had become central to my understanding of personal transformation: that being called nothing by someone who didn't value your authentic self was actually permission to become everything you were meant to be. I accepted immediately, recognizing that this was why the business success mattered beyond personal satisfaction or financial security. Achievement was meaningful primarily as a platform for demonstrating what was possible when someone refused to accept other people's limitations on their potential. The months following the award ceremony brought new opportunities for speaking and consultation that expanded my influence beyond the Austin business community. I was invited to address conferences on entrepreneurship, women's empowerment, and economic development, each engagement providing chances to share the insights that had emerged from my own transformation. More significantly, these speaking opportunities led to the development of a book project that would document both my personal journey and the systematic approach to empowerment that had evolved through our mentorship program. The publisher who approached me was particularly interested in the practical frameworks I'd developed for helping people transition from crisis to stability to success. Writing the book required revisiting aspects of my experience with Derek that I'd largely moved beyond, but the emotional distance of several years allowed me to analyze those patterns with professional objectivity rather than personal pain. Understanding the psychological dynamics that had kept me trapped in diminished expectations became valuable content for helping other women recognize and escape similar situations. The most challenging chapter to write was about forgiveness. Not because I struggled with anger toward Derek, but because I'd learned that forgiveness was far more complex than simply letting go of resentment. True forgiveness, I'd discovered, involved understanding that Derek's behavior toward me was ultimately about his own limitations and insecurities rather than any inadequacy on my part. More importantly, forgiveness included accepting that his abandonment had been exactly what I needed, even though it wasn't what he intended. His cruelty had forced me to discover capabilities and strengths that might have remained dormant indefinitely if I'd continued accommodating his need for control and validation. The book's publication coincided with the 5th anniversary of our restaurant's opening, a milestone that prompted reflection on how much had changed since that first nervous evening of service. We were now recognized as one of Austin's most successful locally owned restaurant groups, but the recognition felt less important than the knowledge that we'd created something sustainable and meaningful. Our mentorship program had evolved into a nonprofit organization with its own board of directors and funding sources, allowing us to serve women throughout Central Texas rather than limiting our impact to those who could work directly within our business operation. The program now included components on financial literacy, legal advocacy, and entrepreneurship training, creating comprehensive support for women rebuilding their lives after trauma or displacement. The nonprofit status also enabled partnerships with other organizations serving similar populations, creating networks of support that extended far beyond what any single program could provide. Watching these collaborations develop reinforced my understanding that meaningful change required collective effort rather than individual heroism. But perhaps the most satisfying development was seeing our original mentorship graduates begin launching their own support programs and business ventures. Jennifer had opened a bakery that employed women in recovery from addiction, while another graduate started a house cleaning cooperative that provided flexible work opportunities for single mothers. Each new enterprise represented a multiplication of impact that extended far beyond our direct involvement, creating ripple effects of empowerment and opportunity throughout the community. This was what success looked like when measured by contribution rather than accumulation: the creation of systems that continued generating positive outcomes long after the initial investment of time and resource. The realization that I'd become someone who created rather than consumed opportunities felt like the completion of a transformation that had begun with Derek's cruel assessment of my work. His prediction that I would amount to nothing without his support had become the foundation for a life dedicated to proving that everyone possessed untapped potential waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Standing in my restaurant on a quiet Tuesday evening, watching the staff prepare for another day of serving customers and creating opportunities for people to grow and contribute, I understood that Derek's worst behavior had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible: the
the chance to discover who I really was when freed from other people's expectations and limitations. The woman he'd abandoned as worthless had built something infinitely more valuable than financial success or professional recognition. I'd created a legacy of empowerment that would continue expanding long after my own story had ended, touching lives I would never meet and inspiring transformations I would never witness. His whispered insult that I was nothing without him had become the rallying cry for a life dedicated to showing the world exactly what nothing could accomplish when given the freedom to become everything. And in that ironic reversal, his cruelest judgment had been transformed into my greatest source of purpose and pride. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.